Hello and welcome back to another episode of TLDR's UK politics podcast, Starmergeddon. I am your host, Georgina Finley, back this week with TLDR's UK politics specialist.
Whoa.
Ben
I can't believe we've not done that one yet.
I know, it's very clinical.
It is clinical.
It's not creative enough for me,
No.
hence why I hadn't gone for it yet. But here we are today, and there is a lot going on in the world, which will form part of our discussion today. But we're also going to be talking about some UK domestic politics, which is why you're here. So our first story, or our main topic today, is going to be about the UK's changes to our abortion laws. We'll then have our cabinet review where we talk about someone in Starmer's cabinet, and then finally an extra story. So let's get into today's main discussion. Ben, do you want to introduce today's topic of abortion and the changes that we're talking about?
Yeah, so I know in the intro you were saying that this has been a big week internationally, and that obviously certainly is true, and as you say, we'll get onto that in a moment. But I think it's also been a really big week domestically for a couple of reasons, and not least because of the most recent changes to, I should say nothing has technically changed yet in terms of the law in regard to abortion. But as a result of some complicated parliamentary procedure, it's looking like very, very likely now that there will be a big change. And this is the result of an amendment that has been agreed to by Parliament on Tuesday, which will likely see, if the bill as a whole goes through, one of the biggest changes to abortion access in the UK in the last almost 60 years, since the 1967 Abortion Act was passed. So just a bit of background on this. The Crime and Policing Bill has been going through Parliament in the last few months. We actually did a video on this on the TLDR News UK channel, so if you haven't seen that and you want to know a bit more, go watch that. But as a very quick summary, it's just a bit of a mishmash of a bill. It's got tons of different things in there, ranging from sort of child sexual offences to sort of lower level sort of antisocial behaviour, effectively. And now, with that, in addition, there's been some changes to the abortion rules in the UK. So there was a vote essentially yesterday on amendments, and there were a few different ones proposed. So the two main ones that were being looked at by journalists were, and we're going to get into some ever so slightly complicated parliamentary procedure here, so just sort of stick with me. There were two that were being proposed. There's NC1 and NC20. Now, you don't really need to know that that's what they're called, but they're basically two different amendments that were looking at changing abortion rules in fairly similar ways, which meant that the Speaker had to sort of choose one or the other. He opted to choose for NC1, which was proposed by a Welsh Labour MP, because it was the one that sort of changed less. It was the less, it moved away from the status quo less. If that was rejected, then he would have selected NC20 to be voted on. As it happened, NC1 was voted on and passed. So obviously, probably now is a good time to go through what the amendment was. Now, the amendment, to understand what the amendment was, we need to understand what the abortion rules are in the UK.
Yeah, so can you take us through the pre-existing law, which was the 1861?
Yes, Offence Against the Persons Act.
Yeah.
So the Offences Against the Person Act of 1861, and there's another relevant bill as well, the Infant Life Preservation Act of 1929. Them together basically mean that abortion is illegal in the UK. The 1967 Abortion Act, it doesn't decriminalise abortion, but it made it legal in certain fixed circumstances. Under the current circumstances, it has to be up to 24 weeks, and it has to be signed off by two doctors and take place in a hospital or premises prescribed by the Secretary of State for Health. So abortion is illegal in the UK, except in those limited circumstances. Now, what that means is that in some instances where when an abortion has taken place post 24 weeks, there has been arrests of women in some quite brutal ways, certainly of women who didn't even know that their pregnancy had gone past 24 weeks. There's some very specific cases which we might get onto in a little bit, which caught the media's attention.
There's also cases where so the 24-week limit is one way in which an abortion can happen outside the legal framework. The other way is the method itself. So
yes,
through abortion pills, for instance, which aren't prescribed through a legal framework. That's another way in which there have been cases of women terminating their own pregnancies.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So this amendment effectively means that women who have an abortion after 24 weeks would no longer be criminalised. However, those that assist a woman in having an abortion post 24 weeks would still be subject to, they'd still be criminalised. And the reason behind this is quite simple. It's that women who have had abortions after that limit are usually women who are in quite bad situations, whether that's to do with home life, whether that's to do with a medical situation in which they find themselves. Again, there's been a number of cases in the last few years where, in certain circumstances, women didn't even know that they were in a pregnancy that had spanned 24 weeks and have been dragged from hospital still bleeding and taken into a prison cell. I mean, that's that happened in modern day Britain. So there's a lot of people that have been looking at that and saying that is not acceptable. That is a result of the law in its current state, and that needs to be changed. And that's what that amendment tries to do. It still criminalises people that assist a woman post 24 weeks in having an abortion, but it doesn't criminalise the woman itself. Now, the other bill that I referenced, so that was voted on, that was approved. So the Crime and Policing Bill, as it stands, includes that amendment. So if the Crime and Policing Bill passes through Parliament and then the Lords, as it is expected to, then that will become the law. It's worth noting that the Crime and Policing Bill is not yet currently law. That amendment has only changed the bill as it currently stands.
Right.
Now, as I previously mentioned, that was one of the amendments. So the other amendment that's worth talking about, and obviously I mentioned earlier, is the NC20 amendment, which was proposed by Labour MP Stella Creasy. Now, that wouldn't just provide an exemption to the woman. This would fully repeal the sections of the 1861 Offence Against the Person Act, which criminalises abortion. And it would also aims to create a human rights framework to ensure that women had access to abortion rights and maintain the 24-week time limit for termination. And it's a similar approach to Northern Ireland. Now, the main thing you've got to understand about this amendment basically is just that it goes further. It goes a lot further than the NC1 amendment. As I said, because of technical parliamentary procedure, that wasn't voted on because the other amendment actually passed. Now, Stella Creasy's written in The Guardian the day after, so we're recording this on Wednesday, the day after the vote happened, and she's obviously not terribly happy that her amendment wasn't voted on and that it didn't go through, and she sees this as sort of a wasted opportunity to expand abortion access and to create it as a human right. In the Guardian article, she obviously speaks about the move in the rest of the world to, the sort of changes that were happening in America, and obviously the implication of abortion access under Trump. Obviously, there was the Roe v. Wade repeal recently. So she was speaking about how important it would be to try and enshrine abortion access as a human right in the UK, which is what her amendment ultimately aimed to do, and that wasn't voted on. But nonetheless, obviously, the NC1 amendment was agreed to. It has changed the Crime and Policing Bill, and if that goes through, a woman who has an abortion after 24 weeks will no longer be criminalised in the UK, which will be the biggest change to abortion access in the UK in 60 years since the Abortion Act of 1967 was first passed.
Yes. And we should also say that this vote that took place in Parliament was a free vote, right? So parties weren't whipping their... No. There was no whip for MPs to vote with party lines or not. And I don't think we actually said the exact figures, but it passed by 379 votes to 137. So it was a significant victory. And I think something else important to add is that the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists have welcomed this change, and their long-standing position has been that women shouldn't be criminalised for abortions. So this is good news for women.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's been welcomed by a number of groups in sort of civil society. You mentioned a couple of examples there. And I think the main thing, and I know we sort of mentioned this earlier when I was doing the research for this today, I think the main thing that sort of came through is just understanding why this was needed and understanding the context behind it. And there were just some of the cases that you see of women in particularly vulnerable situations that have been, I mean, there have been cases where sort of 7 police officers arrive at the door after a woman has had a stillbirth. And, there's been another case, as I mentioned earlier, of a woman in hospital after having surgery being dragged from a hospital to a prison cell while she's still bleeding. I mean, these are the effects of the law as it currently stands. Yeah. And I think the thing that people need to understand about this change is that a lot of women that seek an abortion after that limit, it's largely to do, a lot of women are in vulnerable situations. I know in a situation where I think the police even came out and said that in one of these cases, they found it deeply uncomfortable, the sort of intervention they were expected to make. And that's what this bill is really aiming to do, is it's looking at the women that have had abortions after that limit, how they've been treated, what criminalisation has meant for them. Again, it's really important to note that this NC1 bill it's not trying to change that 24-week limit. It's not saying that doctors are sort of like allowed to do that. It's looking at when that does happen, how do we treat the women? And they're saying that, the bill is basically effectively saying we shouldn't be treating them like criminals. It's a really awful situation that women find themselves in when that happens, and it's trying to treat them with a bit more dignity. I think that is the main thing, the context around this change and why this change needed to be made.
Yeah, I think for any international listeners, perhaps, or American listeners, the debate surrounding abortion in the UK is drastically different to how it is in the US as well.
Of course, yeah.
Maybe some of this is that religion doesn't play as much of a role in politics or political debates in the UK as it currently is in the States. But also this is not a controversial piece of legislation at all. We should make that very clear. This is not going to start hopefully not going to start some kind of massive pro-life versus pro-choice.
I just want to second that as well. This hasn't been a big debate in this country. It's not been something that we've seen the papers go back and forwards on over weeks. This sort of happened to actually relatively limited fanfare, the fanfare in terms of the celebration of it, but not in terms of the sort of debate around it. It's been really, there hasn't really been a debate about it, because it's that debate doesn't really exist here in the same way that it does the States. I just very quickly want to mention just one specific case, because I know that I sort of alluded to some of the context of some legal cases that had happened, and just to really hit this point home. So I think one of the main cases that people had seen was the case of someone called Nicola Packer. And this only happened a couple of months ago that her case actually went to trial. The incident happened 5 years ago in 2020. Now, she was 26 weeks pregnant, but believed that she was only 6 weeks pregnant. And this was to do with the fact of multiple factors why she didn't believe that she was pregnant. This is partly due to her age and not believing that she could be pregnant. She wasn't showing a bump yet. So there was a few reasons why she didn't believe that to be the case. She, when she took the abortion pills at home, she believed she was only 6 weeks pregnant. So she believed she was in the 24-week limit. She's actually 26 weeks pregnant. She took the pills and caused her to have a stillborn baby. She then went to hospital to seek treatment. And this was the case that I sort of alluded to earlier. She had the surgery. She was then arrested in hospital. She was taken to a police van while she was still bleeding after the operation. And she was questioned. And as I say, she had to wait 5 years for the case to go ahead. And she was found eventually not guilty. But this is a result of the law prior to this change. This is the law as it currently stands. That was in the news. I remember seeing that in the news a few months ago when it was going through. So that had sort of caught the attention of lawmakers, I suppose, and of individuals. And it's cases like that. It's cases exactly like that this bill is trying to prevent from happening. Yeah.
It's also, I saw a statistic, I think, that since 1861, there had been only 3, I believe, convictions of women until the past decade or so. And then in the past decade, we've had about 6 different cases. So it goes to show that for whatever reason, there was a massive uptick in criminalisation and prosecution, I guess, of women having abortions outside the legal framework. And that is now changing, hopefully, if this bill goes through the House of Lords.
Yes.
And is fully ratified.
Yeah, it's tricky to know exactly when this bill will be made law, if it obviously does pass through the laws, but it is expected to. It's a government bill. We've already had some votes on it already, and it's looking positive. I know that obviously people watching will be interested to know when this might become law, but just unfortunately, due to how Parliament works and votes and all that kind of thing, it's actually quite tricky to predict. But it is looking likely to go through. So very clear to note that this is obviously an amendment to the bill. The bill isn't through yet, but it is almost certainly going to go through.
Yep. Lovely. So that was the first part of Starmergeddon this week. And before we move on to our cabinet review, I'm going to remind you all about our magazine Too Long, which I've been spending a lot of my recent days working on.
Yeah, we're getting close to that deadline.
Yeah, and this US democracy piece is really difficult. It's probably the hardest thing I've written since we started doing Too Long.
Which means it might be one of the best pieces of writing. And something the viewers will very much want to read.
Yeah, indeed. And if you've read any of our previous magazines actually and had thoughts, which hopefully you have because that's what it's designed to do, then maybe you would like to consider putting those thoughts into writing. In fact, and I've been told to deliver this straight down the barrel of the camera, which I'm doing so now. Scarlett, you can pop me up on screen with my finger. So if you're into politics, if you're engaged in Too Long, if you have thoughts, a hot take, a different opinion, a criticism, and you like writing, then email us at letters@toolong.news and you can ask us for more information. We can talk to you about, how this might look in the magazine, assuage any nerves that you might have, but we would love to hear from people to publish you in our magazine yourselves. So if you'd like to have your letter published in Too Long, do email us and we can help work with you on something. We'll also obviously edit you to sound really great. So don't worry about the writing or anything.
I really want to know about all the uncritical people who are uninterested in politics, who don't have any thoughts. I really want to know about what
we could be getting all kinds of spam into that inbox now that I've just put it out there.
Yeah.
But hopefully we won't. And if anyone is interested, definitely do email us. As I say, we can help you work on something, but it would be really cool to have some more letters because we've only got one so far.
Yeah.
So it'd be good to have some more perspectives. But moving on now to our cabinet review, where this week, given the big story in the international news, we're going to be talking about the Middle East. And Keir Starmer will be our cabinet member to talk about this week. So we're recording this on Wednesday afternoon. I believe also this afternoon, Starmer is hosting an emergency Cobra meeting about the escalating situation in the Middle East, and particularly to discuss what the UK should do with regards to its British citizens currently in Israel, because current Foreign Office guidance is that British citizens should not travel to Israel, but they haven't yet issued guidance recommending citizens to leave. But there have been reports that the Foreign Office has withdrawn family members of British embassy staff based in Israel, which has led to some questions about, okay, why are you taking out embassy staff family members and not yet recommending that your own citizens leave? So we shall have to keep our eyes on what announcements change over the coming days. Of course, by the time this comes out on Friday, probably the situation will look very different. Day by day, with things changing very fast in the Middle East. But it's also an opportunity in our cabinet review to talk about what Starmer might do more broadly with regards to the conflict between Iran and Israel. And I think something that we can mention here is the E3, which is the group of France, Germany, and the UK, have been trying to work more closely on foreign policy in recent months, especially since we've had a new government in Germany, new government in the UK as well last summer, and Macron, who's been around for a while. But the three countries together all have slightly different messaging about the conflict in Iran, between Iran and Israel at the moment. So, for instance, Merz has, and we've heard similar rhetoric from Starmer, reiterated that Germany believes in Israel's right to self-defense. Starmer has said the same thing. We've heard similar from Rachel Reeves on UK TV in recent days. And this, I think, is there are some slightly conflicting messages here, because Israel's right to self-defense is not the justification that Israel invoked to launch its strikes on Iran last week. And there is now some talk in the international press among lawyers and legal experts about the legal justification for those strikes and whether Israel can do that under international law. Of course, Netanyahu's actions in Gaza have been widely condemned by the international legal community and the International Criminal Court as well. But we're increasingly seeing that these kinds of global legal bodies have very little power to affect or persuade or change the actions of governments. So the UK, France and Germany seem a bit they don't want to commit to helping Israel's defense, but they also don't want to commit to condemning Israel's strikes on Iran. Basically, no one really knows what's going to happen in the next few days. Trump himself, we just saw in the office earlier, has made a comment saying, no one knows what I'm going to do next.
Yeah.
So when we talk about what the UK, how the UK is going to respond,
I feel like just jumping on the UK and how the UK is going to respond, it's tricky because Starmer really finds himself caught between a few different sort of competing aims at the minute. On the one side, as you say, Starmer has sort of reiterated Israel's right to self-defense, and Israel's justification for the strikes here was that they were concerned that Iran was getting very close to making a nuclear weapon, which would threaten the survival of Israel. Starmer's gone through a sort of change in attitude recently towards Israel. It's certainly prior to all of this Iran situation. When he was leader of the opposition, when October the 7th happened, he was very quick at the Labour conference to speak up and say that Israel had a right to self-defense, and had sort of stuck by that line for quite a significant amount of time. It was only in the last few months that he started to criticise Israel's the way that Israel's prosecuted the war in Gaza, and he issued a joint statement with Mark Carney and Emmanuel Macron, criticising Netanyahu's actions against the Palestinian people. And he'd sort of reiterated that. The UK had sanctioned 2 senior members of the Israeli government. So Starmer has only recently almost turned not fully like turned on Israel, but certainly his rhetorically turned on Israel. And he's now in a situation where he's sort of trying to back Israel up and suggest that what they're doing at the minute, he's saying that he wants peace in the Middle East, but he's certainly not spoken out against their actions in Iran. He's also trying to align himself with the US, which is tricky when no one knows what the US is doing or going to do. So he's really trying to walk this line of kind of not trying to give credibility to an Israeli regime that is doing what it's doing to the Gazan people, but also suggesting that what they're doing in terms of trying to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons, which the UK doesn't want. They don't want Iran to have nuclear weapons. That's kind of justified, whilst also trying to keep his powder dry and ensure that he doesn't say anything that can then be used against him if he does align himself with whatever Trump does next. So he's really in this sort of bind of all these different aims and conflicting things that he's trying to do. And it just complicates things even more when he has no clue, and seemingly even Trump doesn't know what he's going to do next. So yeah, it's a real mess of a situation, and the UK just doesn't really know how to place itself, it seems.
Yeah, but I agree with everything you said. And I think currently, speaking in terms of facts, the UK has dispatched more British military assets to the Middle East. We've sent fighter jets to the region. Starmer has not ruled out action in defense of Israel. However, that's very unlikely, I think, from a UK perspective, because Iran has made very clear that if the UK, Germany or France helps Israel in shooting down Iranian rockets or defending Israel in whatever sense from Iran's retaliation, that, all hell, this is not...
They'll target UK military sites.
They will target British or French, German bases, in the area. So it is not in Starmer's or the UK's interest to become involved in this conflict whatsoever. But as we've said, nobody knows what Trump is going to do. Nobody knows how the E3 group will potentially be involved somehow. Nobody knows what's going to happen next.
Well, it's possible that of that E3 group, two, i.e. France and Germany, decide that they don't want to align themselves with the US if the US decides that it wants to conduct military action alongside the Israeli government, and the UK aligns itself with the US and Israel and the other two don't. It's like there is a world in which the three don't move together. And that would be similar to what happened with the Iraq War, essentially. And obviously the UK sees itself as being more aligned, certainly internationally, with the US than the other two. And Starmer has certainly had a more sort of Trump-aligned strategy than the other two have since Trump has been re-elected. So I could certainly see Starmer breaking away from that. It's just tricky. It is really tricky to predict what's going to happen here, especially as I've already sort of outlined that with the conflicting aims of Starmer at the minute. But I don't know what you think the most likely outcome is, but I really do think that Starmer will try his hardest to stay out of it.
Yeah, absolutely. We should end this section by saying Starmer's been very clear. He says this every time he does an interview, that I'm working for de-escalation, repeating that he's doing so with France and with Germany, and that's what they're all pushing for. So that is, of course, what we're working with and what we have to believe at this point. This brings us on to our final story today, which is on the assisted dying bill vote going through Parliament on Friday.
Yes. So this is the third reading of the assisted dying bill. So this is obviously a really big piece of legislation, and one that has been going through all of the sort of channels in the Commons for scrutiny and criticism for months now. Obviously, this has attracted a lot of controversy. It's a really controversial piece of legislation, not just because of the principles of the bill, but also the specifics and whether the protections go far enough. So it's worth sort of just going backwards a little bit here. So the UK currently doesn't allow for assisted dying. Obviously, there's a number of Western countries in recent years, obviously Canada being a sort of notable example, that have introduced assisted dying bills and legislation. The UK hasn't done this. So this is the first realistic piece of legislation that might actually pass that's happened in the UK. So this was proposed by Kim Leadbeater, a Labour MP, and the vote on Friday basically is the final chance for MPs to have their say before it goes through to the House of Lords. So if it passes, if MPs agree to it on Friday, then it is only down to the Lords. And just to reiterate to sort of non-British viewers, the House of Lords can only delay legislation. They can't fully block it. So it would be likely, I think, for it to then go through if it does get through the House of Commons. Obviously, a delay would be tricky, but it probably would still pass. Now, the bill, in terms of specifics, would allow people with a life expectancy of 6 months or less to end their lives on their own terms. The safeguards included in that is that the patient must be able to take the fatal drugs themselves, and they need to have the approval of 2 doctors. Now, one of the amendments that has already passed and has been made is in the bill as originally written, a High Court judge had to sign off on any decisions for final approval for a decision to end someone's life. That has now been changed to an expert panel comprising of a voluntary assisted dying commissioner, a psychiatrist, and a social worker. Now, Kim Leadbeater, who, as I've said, proposed the bill, has suggested that actually increases the safeguards to the patients. Opponents argue that it fundamentally weakens the protections. And as a result of that change, the Royal College of Physicians and the Royal College of Psychiatrists actually removed their support for the bill after that change. So even some of the changes within the bill have proved controversial so far. Now, there will be votes on amendments on Friday, and then there will be a vote on the bill as amended. It did pass, it has already passed the second reading with a majority of 55, but just as a sign of how controversial the bill was, there were 150 amendments that were tabled. So it is a very deeply controversial piece of legislation. It's controversial, as I've already said, not just because of the principles that it's trying to enact, but also because of the specifics and people suggesting that it doesn't have enough protections for people. I mean, one of the most significant interventions this week, actually about the bill itself, was from the former Labour Prime Minister Gordon Brown, who wrote a piece in The Guardian basically opposing the bill. Brown basically argued that there's no freedom to choose if the alternative option, the freedom to draw on high quality end-of-life care, isn't available, and nor is there freedom if people feel under pressure to relieve their relatives from the burden of caring for them. He argues that prioritising good end-of-life care would diminish that, and that's more important. That's effectively his argument. So that was his intervention this week. Obviously, he's a former Labour Prime Minister. He's a significant figure in the UK, and he's someone that I think I would have expected to be a little bit more supportive of the bill. So it's just an example of how controversial this is, and that this doesn't sort of split among party lines in ways that people might have expected it to. Similar to the abortion vote that you mentioned earlier, this will be a free vote, so MPs will not be whipped by party lines. But it is just really hard to say which way this is going to go. So I think for people watching this, I think it's really important to keep an eye on this on Friday and see exactly how it goes.
There we go. Apologies for a slightly morbid episode today. It was a pretty heavy one.
Yeah, definitely a heavy episode today, yeah.
Yeah, but it's a heavy time in geopolitics at the moment.
And domestic politics.
And domestic politics. So hope everyone is looking after themselves. Hope you have a lovely weekend.
Enjoy the sun.
Enjoy the sun. Hope you've got it where you are. It's really sweaty in London at the moment.
Yeah.
It's too much. Yeah, too much for me. But yes, join us here again in 2 weeks' time on Starmergeddon, and have a lovely time until then. Bye.